Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session on Tourism Insights. My name is Rachel Reed. I head up the new insight capability that we have at ETOA. If you haven't already seen it, do take a look at our new Insight Hub, which is on our website. I have here with me David Edwards, our resident tourism stats expert. Delighted to have you on board, David. He and I are going to be looking at the difficult conundrum of city tourism stats in this session and looking at how is it we can really count the number of visitors that there are. We're using as the basis of our discussion a document that David has written for us, which is available on the Insight Hub. So you can go and have a look at that after the event and see some of the other pieces we've got up there as well. Now, of course, David, especially in times like now, if we want to understand the consequence of not having tourism, we want to know how we measure the actual number of visitors we had in the first place. And I think this is a very interesting area of discussion because so many times you can read a document that has figures for London or Paris or Amsterdam, and yet they can be really quite different. So I think it's really important to kind of get a handle on what we're actually seeing and understanding why it is that they might not marry up. So over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and hello to everybody watching and listening. So yes, indeed, our topic for the next little while is to discuss this thorny old issue of why can you read one figure one day and then apparently the next day read a rather different figure for what on the face of it appears to be for the same measure. So yes, it's London, Paris and Amsterdam. And our question is, how many international visitors are there? So the issue is that while all agree these are three of the most important city destinations in Europe for international travel, estimates for the number of international visitors appear to be very inconsistent. Let us start our travels around this part of Europe in London. And here we're looking at a trend chart taken from the UK's Office for National Statistics International Passenger Survey, which is looking at the number of overnight visits by overseas residents in thousands. So first of all, let's just look at the trend. Well, we can see that in the early 2000s, there was a decent period of growth. Then we saw the global financial crisis and a period of either contracting or plateauing numbers. Before, from about 2013 onwards, there was a period of what might well be termed above trend growth. Then in the past 2 or 3 years, things have flattened off somewhat. And as we can see that at the present, we're looking at around about in 2019, 21 million overnight visits by overseas residents to London. Now, handily, this survey also presents figures for what are called visitor nights, and the equivalent figure to this 21 million is 110 million visitor nights. So a word or two then on what this International Passenger Survey actually is. Well, it's a continuous survey that's been running since way back in 1961, and it has a really broad set of aims. It's trying to collect information on both inbound and outbound travel to and from the UK, but also included in its reason for being is to measure the volume of migration to and from the UK. So it's doing lots of different things. Now, the survey is actually conducted at ports and airports, and in 2019, around 35,000 departing visitors were interviewed. This isn't all of the people who were interviewed by the surveyors, but this is the number who were interviewed having visited the UK for one of the reasons that we typically talk about as being for tourism. So what is actually being counted? Thinking about London figures from the International Passenger Survey, it's any overseas resident spending at least one night in any form of accommodation in Greater London, regardless of the journey purpose, provided they are staying in the UK for less than 1 year. So we've got a number of important terms going on there. We've got Greater London, and there's a geographical thing going on there. And we've got the fact that they have to be staying in the UK for less than 1 year. So that means anyone visiting for a day trip, either perhaps just popping into the UK and London for a day, or maybe who is staying somewhere out in Oxfordshire or north of London, who is then travelling into London for the day, they're actually excluded from this tally. However, those staying as a free guest of friends or relatives, or indeed those who might be staying in their own home, they are actually being counted in this tally of 21 million overseas residents making an overnight visit to Greater London. Now, another important facet of the International Passengers Survey is that it is measuring overseas residents, not just overseas nationals. As such, visiting expats are going to be included in our total. Now, whilst it's fairly uncommon in the UK, most of us will be familiar with the idea of going into a hotel somewhere in continental Europe and being asked to present our passport. And that then provides quite a lot of very informative data on nationality, but clearly doesn't tell us necessarily about place of permanent residence. Whereas here, the International Passenger Survey figure is based on where you're permanently resident rather than your nationality. Now, the highly respected European Cities Marketing Organisation present a whole realm of different data in their annual benchmarking reports. And if we look at London, one of the headline figures that jumps out for international is 60 million for London. And well, that looks rather different to the 21 million, doesn't it? But if we look in detail at what this data is actually representing, it is in fact bed nights by international tourists in all forms of accommodation establishment. So this is lower than the IPS estimate, which was 110 million visitor nights. So why have we got this apparent diversion from around 60 million to 110 million? Well, the 60 million figure from European Cities Marketing does not include those staying as a free guest of friends and relatives, or those who are staying in their own home. If we interrogate the IPS accommodation level data in a bit more depth, that tells us that around about 66 million visitor nights were spent in London once these forms of accommodation are actually excluded, giving us an average length of stay of about 5 nights in London. So now what we're seeing is that even though we're looking at two somewhat different sources, we're getting figures that are an awful lot closer together because we're sticking on nights rather than visits, and we're trying to keep our forms of accommodation as close as possible together. So how reliant then can we say that London is on international tourism? Well, again, here we have to try and be careful to ensure that we're looking at similar measures. And if we take the European Cities Marketing approach of studying bed nights in all forms of accommodation establishments, this then suggests that approximately 80% reliance of London on international tourism, and clearly in the rather challenging times that we find ourselves in at present, the degree of reliance on international travel is going to perhaps be a key yardstick of how easy it is for different destinations to recover. Now let's move on to think about data for Paris. And here we will again begin with a trend chart. This is drawn from rather excellent data from INSEE, which in large regard is the equivalent French institution of the UK Office for National Statistics. And I think good congratulations to so many different European stats agencies who do make their data available through an English language portal, which I must say here in the UK, we're fairly poor at making our data available in other languages. But back to the data then that we can see from INSEE for overnight hotel arrivals by foreign residents, again in thousands, in Paris. Looking at the trend, we can see broadly it's fairly stable at between 9 and 10 million. We can see a dip going on there. That, of course, was a time where there was a heightened amount of terrorism taking place in France and indeed Paris. But as we often see after such events, some degree of bounce back thereafter, such that in the past couple of years, it really has been around about 10 million. And again, we can use the same source of information for a figure on the number of nights in hotels in Paris. And that tells us that in 2019, so the most recent full year, obviously for which data is available, it was around about 25 million.
That's very interesting, David. And if I can just cut in a moment to welcome the delegates who have just joined us in this session. I'm here with David Edwards, our resident stats expert, and we're discussing city tourism tax stats, and we're looking at figures for London, Paris, and Amsterdam. And why is it that different places can report things very differently? And David's filling us in on the different ways of measuring. We've covered London, and we're currently in Paris. So do tell us, what is being counted in Paris, David?
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. I shall endeavour to do that. And I do think that perhaps city tourism tax could be a whole different session on its own, but back to city tourism stats. So for Paris, what is being counted by INSEE, which is the French equivalent of the Office for National Statistics here in the UK, is any foreign resident spending at least one night in, quote, hotels and similar accommodation in Paris. Really important here because, again, INSEE is very good at making different levels of geographic data available. And this is Paris, it's not Greater Paris. And as we saw earlier when we were discussing London, the figures are for what is termed Greater London. So not just that core inner area that is most typically visited by tourists. Here, though, we are looking at Paris, not Greater Paris. The estimates are based on a survey that is commissioned and conducted by INSEE, and it's a hotel occupancy survey. What we talked about earlier when thinking about London stats was that the main data comes from a survey that's conducted as people leave the country at ports and airports. And that's why it covers such a broad range of different places that people can stay in. However, here we are reliant on a survey that is actually taking place in hotels. So the data excludes those staying in Paris in all, quote, non-hotel accommodation. For example, those who might be staying with their friends or relatives, or those who might be staying in their own home when they're visiting Paris. Crucially, it also excludes any day trips to central Paris by international visitors who perhaps are staying elsewhere in France, or indeed who are happening to visit Paris and indeed France itself just for the day and are spending the night before and the night after in a different country. By contrast, if we look at the headline figures from the European Cities Marketing very excellent benchmarking report, we get a figure of around 25 million. So that at first face value says, oh, look, we're looking at 25 million compared to 10 million. However, the ECM figure is for total bed nights. And what's clear then is that this is a count of nights and not of visits. And indeed, once we compare this figure with the equivalent nights figure from INSEE, we have data that is very, very similar. This suggests to us then an average length of stay in Paris which is lower than in London. with the Paris figure being 3 nights, and as we saw earlier, the estimate for London round about 5 nights. One of the reasons for this is that London does attract quite a large number of particularly long stay visitors, often from the Middle East, who come to Europe and in particular London during the summer months, which drives up that overall average. How reliant then is Paris on international tourism? If we take the European cities marketing approach of studying bed nights in all forms of accommodation establishment, this suggests an approximate 66% reliance on international tourism for Paris. Now, when we were discussing London earlier, we saw that London is about 80%. So this is telling us that Paris is still heavily reliant, certainly, on international travel, but a little bit less reliant than is London. Now, on our European journey, let us start thinking about the situation for data in Amsterdam. We'll start as we started for London and indeed for Paris by looking at a trend chart. This data is taken from Statistics Netherlands, and that is the equivalent of INSEE in Paris and the Office for National Statistics in the UK. So it is the National Statistics Agency. And once again, it makes available a wealth of data on all manner of topics, including, of course, tourism. And their headline stats are for overnight hotel stays by foreign residents in thousands. Note, because this is important later on, that hotel is in quotation marks there. What do we see from this trend, however? Well, we can see that compared with Paris and London, there really are no dips in this trend. It is fairly persistently heading upwards, meaning that back in 2012, the Statistics Netherlands was reporting a figure for just under about 5 million, whereas by 2019, we are about 7.5 million overnight hotel stays by foreign residents in Amsterdam. What then is actually being counted by Statistics Netherlands? Well, there's a very detailed uh, analysis here, and it tells us that any foreign resident spending at least one night in, quote, all hotels, motels, boarding houses, apartments with hotel services, youth accommodation, and bed and breakfasts with at least 5 sleeping places. So that's quite a detailed, very helpful definition, but we can start to see why, for shorthand, it's termed hotels if you just want a heading for a slide or a table in a report. But this is one of the challenges that we face when comparing data. As such, the following is excluded by Statistics Netherlands from their figures. Holidays on own or third-party boats, which of course in Amsterdam can be quite a significant chunk of the market, stays in second home, cruises, and overnight stays in what Statistics Netherlands calls new emerging forms like social travelling. Furthermore, day visits and visits to family and friends are not included. So we can see there's quite a broad number of types of international trips and overnights that are not being counted in this tally. By contrast, the European Cities Marketing Excellent Annual Benchmarking figure is around 16 million. And at first sight, we might say, oh, that's very different then to this 7.5 million figure that we see from Statistics Netherlands. But crucially, this ECM figure is for total bed nights. And that means it's a count of the number of nights, not of visits. So, for example, you arrive, you spend 3 nights somewhere, you're counting 3 to this ECM tally, whereas you're only counting 1 to the Statistics Netherlands tally for the number of visits. This suggests an average length of stay of a little over 2 nights, which is notably lower than London and Paris. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why, of our three cities that we are discussing, over tourism is a word that is more regularly applied to Amsterdam than it is to either Paris or London, because there's a shorter length of stay, and there is, of course, a wide range of things that visitors do when they go to a place, but many tourists will do the same things as other tourists. And if those same things are being squashed into 2 nights rather than 3 nights in Paris or 5 nights in London, clearly you're perhaps going to have more compression going on.
That's very interesting to hear, David. I'm looking forward to carrying on this discussion in a moment. After I just say welcome to the delegates who have just joined us, I'm here with David Edwards, our resident tourism stats expert, and we're looking today at city tourism stats. We are comparing London, Paris, and Amsterdam. We're on Amsterdam right now, and we're looking at why it is there are so many discrepancies in the way that different destinations measure stats. And then we're going to think about which one we should actually be picking. And of course, differences in measuring the value of tourism also pose issues when one's looking at the consequences of not having tourism, as is the case for our destinations at the moment. So let us carry on with Amsterdam, David.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and hello to those who've just joined. So what we've established is that if we use the Statistics Netherlands figure, we would immediately think, oh, there's around about 7.5 to 8 million international visits to Amsterdam. And then if we very quickly look up a figure from European Cities Marketing Benchmarking, we'll see a figure of 16 million and think, hang on, these numbers are really different. But what we've established is that the Statistics Netherlands figure of 7.5 to 8 million is for the number of visits to hotels in a fairly broad definition of hotel. But the ECM figure is for bed nights. So if you are spending 3 nights, you will be counted as a 3 towards this 16 million tally, whereas you're only going to be counting 1 towards the tally made by Statistics Netherlands. So how reliant then on international tourism is Amsterdam? Well, if we take the European cities marketing approach of studying bed nights in all forms of accommodation establishments, this suggests an approximate 85% reliance on international tourism for Amsterdam. And as we saw earlier, for those who have followed other sessions, or may indeed later on follow other sessions, is that in London, it was around about 80%, and in Paris, it was around about 66% reliance on international travel. This is really important, particularly in these challenging times that we find ourselves in, because the common currency belief is that domestic tourism is going to recover rather more quickly than international travel. Therefore, those destinations and those cities that perhaps typically attract a broader number of domestic as well as international visitors may well recover more quickly. Now let's try and summarize then what we have discovered when looking at stats for London, for Paris, and for Amsterdam. Well, typically, discrepancies in the data that you will find knocking around is due to a range of different definitions that may relate to geography. We discussed the difference between Greater Paris and Paris, Greater London and Inner London. Those discrepancies may arise due to visitor origin definitions, and it's really easy just to look at a number and think that, oh, this is about all types of visitor, regardless of whether they're international or domestic. But look at the words in detail, look at any small print, any footnotes, because it may well be that numbers that appear to be really different to one another are actually measuring precisely the same thing, but one is all, both domestic and international, and one is just international. Discrepancies may also arise due to things relating to visitor nationality. because if the way of gathering data is from a person's passport when it's presented at a hotel check-in, and that passport is from the country in which the hotel happens to be, that won't show up as a foreign visitor. Whereas if it's a foreign passport, clearly it will. But when we were talking about London, what we discovered is that the figures are based on where you're permanently resident, regardless of your nationality. So a British expat travelling back and spending time in London, they will be counted as part of the number of international visits to London. Trip purpose could be another reason for the discrepancy. Some measures may be looking solely at trips that are for different forms of leisure or business and maybe excluding perhaps longer term study trips. Length of stay, a really important measure. All of the data that we've looked at for London, for Paris and Amsterdam has involved overnight stays and for the most part has had as its upper length limit 1 year. But perhaps most crucially, in terms of why discrepancies arise in different measures of how many international visitors there are to different cities, is down to the form of accommodation. We have seen that this can range from quite narrow definitions of hotels to a slightly broader definition, as we saw in Amsterdam, where we encompass things like bed and breakfast, so long as they've got 5 or more bed spaces. Whereas for London and the UK's International Passenger Survey, in fact, it will include those who are staying in their own home and indeed those who are staying as a free guest of friends and relatives. So lots of different reasons why the numbers vary. So when disparate estimates exist, it's really important to check carefully the precise wording used and any footnotes that may apply. So which city of the 3 that we've discussed receives the most international visits? Drumroll. Sadly, we don't really know. But on as close a like-for-like basis as it is possible to estimate, London probably has a relatively small lead over Paris for visits, but a larger lead in terms of visitor nights. But that lead for London over Paris is perhaps slightly smaller than some of the types of measures that we might see. But both London and Paris welcome more international visits than Amsterdam, whether on the narrow or indeed on the wide measure of accommodation. But we should, of course, bear in mind that Amsterdam, spatially speaking, is a smaller city than Paris or Amsterdam, or Paris or London. So there we go, Rachel. That's a discussion of visits to London, to Paris and Amsterdam, and why, even with the best will in the world, it's not really possible to precisely say how many international visits there are. But if you're really careful at looking at the definitions, you can start to figure out why there appear to be this whole menu of different data from which we can choose.
Thank you, David. I think it's really interesting to see just all the options that people have. Just while we have a sort of dying moment of our session left, one thing that occurred to me, and I'd love to get your opinion, is do you think there should be a standard that we have to comply with? Because obviously at the moment, destinations can do it how they like within certain parameters. Should we have a hard and fast standard on this, David?
In a sense, UNWTO is giving each destination a set of definitions that it should be applying in terms of what's a visitor, what's a tourist, what's called an excursionist. However, it's really easy on paper to describe this is how or who you should be measuring. The difficulties arise when we're trying to put that into practice because different cities have different geographies. London is part of an island, and it's much more the case that you cross a border when travelling to the UK than when travelling to Paris or Amsterdam, because, as we all know, you can get in your car in Frankfurt or on a train in Frankfurt and travel really without border checks to Amsterdam or to Paris. Therefore, that's why very often data on tourism is collected in continental Europe by surveys of arrivals at accommodation, which is great because that can, in a sense, give you more data than a at border survey, but is more limited in terms of its scope because it's not going to capture those people who do not stay at one of those registered forms of accommodation. So even if there were a series of diktats in terms of what you should be measuring, I think just the difficulties of applying that in different geographies, in different circumstances, would still mean we would end up with at least different forms of apples, if not apples and pears.
David, thank you very much. I look forward to eating one of my different forms of apple, and I wish our delegates a pleasant day.